A brilliant guildmaster of a fiercely powerful merchant family dies in a tragic carriage accident and transmigrates into the body of Wei Wanyue, the notoriously spoiled and universally despised daughter of the Grand Chancellor. She wakes up in a bridal palanquin on her way to marry Crown Prince Zhao Jingting, a cold, calculating military genius who is destined to execute her for treason in exactly 2 years. Determined to avoid her poisoned fate, Wanyue decides to treat the marriage as a high-stakes merchant negotiation. She drafts an ironclad written covenant, offering to manage his chaotic inner court and secure his military supply lines in exchange for her life and a massive chest of silver taels upon their quiet separation. But when she unrolls the meticulous stipulations on the bridal bed, the deeply suspicious prince assumes she is executing a brilliant, confounding psychological attack. Now, Wanyue must navigate deadly palace intrigue, balance the imperial ledgers, and manage a strategic alliance with a dangerous royal who is slowly becoming obsessed with his terrifyingly efficient wife. They say love is unpredictable, and today's story proves it. Welcome to Romance Crave Stories, where every episode is full of passion, secrets, and emotional twists. Let's begin. Arranged marriages within the imperial court are inherently treacherous, but they rarely involve a heavily guarded palanquin, an ornate red veil, and the imminent threat of being poisoned by your new husband. Yet here I was. In my previous life, I was the master of a fiercely powerful trading guild. I built my empire on unbreakable covenants and flawless ledgers, mastering the art of the deal across all major trade routes. But after a tragic carriage accident on a steep mountain pass, I woke up with a pounding headache, dressed in layers of suffocating embroidered red silk, bouncing along to the rhythm of a traditional wedding procession. A quick review of my inherited memories revealed a catastrophic reality. I had transmigrated into the body of Wei Wanyue, the infamously vicious and entirely detested daughter of the Grand Chancellor. My current destination? The Eastern Palace. My groom? Crown Prince Zhao Jingting, a man known for his brilliant military strategy, his freezing demeanor, and his absolute, unyielding hatred for the Wei clan. According to the political landscape, and the rumors I recalled from this body's memories, Wanyue's arranged marriage was a thinly veiled espionage plot orchestrated by her father. Within 2 years, Jingting would uncover the treason, bypass any formal decrees of separation, and serve her a cup of poisoned wine. I do not accept failure, and I certainly refuse to be poisoned. Panic is a foolish waste of breath. As the palanquin swayed, I removed the heavy, pearl-beaded veil and began to strategize. I was walking into a hostile negotiation. Zhao Jingting held all the power, the military backing, and the advantage of his own estate. I had a terrible reputation and a massive target on my back. Fleeing into the night would result in my family's assassins hunting me down for my betrayal. Staying the course would result in the prince executing me. The only logical solution was to aggressively renegotiate the terms of our union. If the crown prince desired a political pawn, he was going to be deeply disappointed. What he was receiving instead was a terrifyingly competent master of his household. My plan was straightforward. I would draft a mutually beneficial, heavily stipulated written covenant. I would offer my skills to streamline his disastrously inefficient inner court, essentially managing his servants, eliminating spies, and restoring his public prestige, while shielding him from my father's political machinations. In return, I demanded full autonomy, a secluded courtyard, and a generous compensation of 50,000 silver taels to be paid out upon our quiet, amicable separation in exactly 3 years. It was a flawless proposal. There was just one variable I had not considered. Prince Zhao Jingting was deeply, violently suspicious. When I finally met him in the bridal chambers and presented a freshly brushed parchment, he did not see a pragmatic ally. He saw a spectacularly unhinged woman executing the most confounding assassination plot in the history of the empire. Chapter 1. The bridal chamber of the Eastern Palace was suffocatingly red. Thick, crimson dragon and phoenix candles flickered atop heavy bronze stands, casting dancing shadows across the sweeping silk curtains of the canopy bed. I was currently sweating through no less than 5 layers of densely embroidered wedding garments, the intricate gold threading feeling more like chainmail than celebratory attire. I sat rigidly on the edge of the mattress, a bamboo writing brush held perfectly straight in my right hand, a long scroll of premium parchment unrolled across my lap. I was in the process of meticulously brushing the 4th stipulation: compensation and indemnification regarding the Grand Chancellor's assassins. The heavy mahogany doors groaned, the sound echoing through the silent courtyard outside. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. Crown Prince Zhao Jingting stepped over the threshold. He was tall, dressed in dark crimson robes woven with subtle, shifting gold threads, and possessed the sharp, devastatingly handsome features of a man sculpted for command. But his dark eyes were frigid, sweeping over me with a mixture of profound disgust and lethal suspicion. He rested his hand casually on the jade hilt of his sword, his posture radiating hostility. "Wei Wanyue," he said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised violence. "I see you have dispensed with the pretense of the bridal veil. Excellent. We can skip the false pleasantries." "Agreed," I replied briskly, carefully blowing on the wet ink to dry it before rolling up the scroll. I stood, ignoring the sheer weight of the heavy gold hairpins threatening to snap my neck, and walked purposefully toward the central tea table. "Please sit. We have a great deal of logistical groundwork to cover before the morning bells ring." Jingting froze, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. He looked at the empty porcelain teacups, then at my ink-stained fingers. "What game is this? A new poison your father devised? Or do you plan to bore me to death with poetry?" "Neither. I plan to extend your life expectancy and your political leverage," I said smoothly, slapping the scroll onto the table and unrolling it with a sharp, practiced flick of my wrist. "This is a 3-year, mutually binding covenant. Please review the primary stipulations." The Crown Prince slowly approached the table, his hand never leaving the hilt of his weapon. He looked down at the parchment, expecting to see a cursed Taoist talisman or a coded message meant for a spy network. Instead, he saw meticulously structured clauses, written in perfectly spaced, entirely unemotional calligraphy. "The first stipulation," I narrated, tapping the parchment with the wooden end of my brush. "I will not sleep in this room, nor will I demand any marital duties from you. The second, I will govern your inner court. Your current stewards are stealing from your winter grain reserves at a severe rate, which is an unacceptable loss of resources for a military commander. I will discipline the staff and restore order to your ledgers. The third, in exchange for my absolute loyalty and administrative labor, you will not poison me, stab me, or frame me for treason. In 3 years' time, we formally separate, and I receive a compensation of 50,000 silver taels for my services." Jingting stared at the scroll. He stared at me. The sheer, overwhelming audacity of a hated political enemy offering to manage his household accounts and demanding a fortune in silver completely confounded his battle-hardened mind. "You," he started, his voice losing its icy edge, replaced by utter, profound bewilderment. "You wish to audit my servants." "I wish to command them properly," I corrected sharply. "Now, I have already stamped my seal at the bottom. I need your signature right here." I pushed the heavy stone inkwell toward him, offering the brush. But just as his fingers twitched toward the handle, a sudden, sharp whistling sound tore through the quiet night air. Before I could even blink, Jingting moved with terrifying speed. He lunged across the table, tackling me hard to the floor just as the paper window shattered inward. A black feathered arrow buried itself exactly where my head had been a fraction of a second prior. The iron arrowhead piercing straight through my flawless calligraphy and pinning the top of our newly drafted covenant violently to the mahogany wood. Chapter 2. The heavy, crushing weight of the Crown Prince pinned me flat against the cold floorboards. My heavy gold headpiece dug painfully into my scalp, and the air between us was suddenly thick with the scent of sandalwood, sharp steel, and impending death. Any ordinary noblewoman of the capital would have swooned, or perhaps wept from the sheer terror and inappropriate proximity of her new, terrifying husband. I, however, was glaring past his broad shoulder at the splintered wood of the tea table. That table was crafted from imported southern heartwood, I calculated grimly. At least 80 silver taels ruined in a single strike. And my premium parchment is completely unsalvageable. Jingting did not linger to share in my financial frustration. In one fluid, terrifyingly graceful motion, he rolled off me, his jade-hilted sword singing a deadly note as it cleared its scabbard. He kicked the shattered remnants of the paper window outward, diving into the moonlit courtyard like a hunting leopard. Sounds of a brief, brutal struggle echoed through the quiet estate. The harsh clash of steel, a muffled groan, the heavy thud of a body hitting the stone path, and then absolute silence. I calmly sat up, dusting off my heavy red silk robes. I reached up and pulled the heaviest of the gold phoenix pins from my hair, setting them aside to ease the strain on my neck. Walking over to the ruined table, I firmly gripped the shaft of the black feathered arrow and wrenched it from the wood. It was an exceptionally forged iron broadhead, a highly expensive, professional weapon. The mahogany doors slammed open, shaking on their hinges. Jingting strode back into the bridal chamber, his drawn sword dripping fresh crimson onto the woven floor mats. In his left hand, he gripped a heavy bronze command token. His chest heaved with exertion, and his dark eyes locked onto me with a fury so absolute it made the room feel like an ice cellar in the dead of winter. Before I could politely inquire about the state of his courtyard sentries, he crossed the room in 3 massive strides. His large hand shot out, grabbing the thick embroidered collar of my wedding robes. With a terrifying surge of strength, he slammed my back hard against the wooden pillar of the canopy bed. The cold, bloodied steel of his sword was instantly pressed flush against the delicate skin of my throat. "Give me one reason why I should not sever your head from your shoulders right this moment," Jingting snarled, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. He raised his left hand, thrusting the blood-stained bronze token in front of my face. I looked calmly at the token, not daring to swallow against the edge of his blade. Stamped perfectly into the center of the heavy metal was the elegant, unmistakable crest of the Wei clan. "My father's house. Your father sent his elite executioners to the Eastern Palace on our wedding night," Jingting hissed, the blade pressing a millimeter closer to my skin, his eyes burning with suspicion and hatred. He struck the moment my guards changed shifts. "Explain yourself, Wei Wanyue. Why does the Grand Chancellor want his own daughter dead before the union is even consummated?" Chapter 3. I did not flinch. Even with the cold steel of the Crown Prince's blade biting into the top layer of my skin, my mind automatically calculated the political cost of my own murder. Because a dead daughter on a wedding night is infinitely more valuable than a living one. I answered, my voice steady, though I kept my chin tilted up to avoid slicing my own throat on his sword. "Think, Your Highness. If I die in your chambers tonight, my father plays the devastated, grieving chancellor. He immediately petitions the emperor, claiming you murdered his beloved child in a fit of rage. It gives him the righteous, legal mandate he needs to mobilize the imperial guard, raid this estate, and strip you of your military command." Jingting's eyes narrowed, the gears in his brilliant, strategic mind turning rapidly as he assessed my words. "I am not a beloved daughter," I continued coldly, my eyes locked on his. "I am a discarded pawn. A sacrificial lamb meant to trigger your downfall. If you kill me now, or let my father's assassins finish the job, you give the Wei clan exactly what they want." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the room was the harsh dripping of blood from the assassin's token onto the floor mats. Finally, Jingting lowered the sword, stepping back. The murderous intent in his eyes was replaced by a dark, calculating respect. "You are as ruthless as the rumors claim," Jingting murmured, wiping his blade clean with a cloth from the table. "Though the rumors conveniently left out your intelligence." "Very well, Wei Wanyue. We have a temporary alliance. Survive the night, and tomorrow you may have your inner court." I did not just survive the night. I spent it redrafting my ruined covenant on fresh parchment. By the time the morning bells chimed across the capital, I was entirely prepared to take control of my new enterprise. I discarded the heavy, impractical wedding silks for a set of crisp, unadorned indigo robes, the color of a serious merchant ready to inspect their cargo. I ordered a heavy wooden desk carried out into the center of the Eastern Palace's main courtyard, sat down, and demanded that every servant, steward, and maid be assembled before me. Over 100 staff members gathered in the morning sun, murmuring amongst themselves. At the front of the crowd stood head steward Peng, a portly man with a face like a steamed bun and eyes that gleamed with arrogant condescension. He clearly believed I was merely a spoiled, foolish girl playing at authority. "Crown Princess," Steward Peng said, offering a shallow, deeply disrespectful bow as he dropped a massive stack of bamboo slips and bound paper ledgers onto my desk. "The estate accounts, as requested. Though I fear the numbers may be a bit taxing for a young lady's mind." I ignored his insolence. I reached for my personal rosewood abacus, my fingers flying over the wooden beads with a speed that made the surrounding servants blink in surprise. I flipped through the ledgers, scanning the brushstrokes, my eyes catching the deliberate obfuscations almost immediately. The math was sloppy. "Steward Peng," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. I did not look up from the pages. According to the autumn harvest logs, the Eastern Palace received 10,000 shur of grain. Yet, the winter reserve tallies only reflect 7,000. Explain the deficit of 3,000 shur. Steward Peng's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The dampness of the storehouses, Wangfei. A terrible tragedy. Mildew and rats claimed a significant portion of the harvest. Rats, I repeated flatly. I slapped the ledger shut, the sound echoing like a whip crack. 3,000 shur of grain is enough to feed an entire infantry battalion for a month. Unless your rats are wearing armor and wielding spears, it is physically impossible for them to consume that volume without leaving a mountain of evidence. You are falsifying the ledgers and selling the Crown Prince's military provisions on the black market. A collective gasp swept through the courtyard. Steward Peng's face turned an ugly shade of puce. He realized instantly that I was not a foolish girl he could manipulate. I was a threat to his highly lucrative embezzlement ring. He dropped all pretense of respect, his features twisting into a vicious sneer. You overstep, little girl, Peng spat, his hand reaching into his wide silk sleeve. You hold no real power here. You are a prisoner in this palace, just waiting for the executioner's blade. With a sharp intake of breath, the head steward pulled a bone whistle to his lips and blew a shrill, piercing note. The heavy wooden gates of the courtyard slammed shut. From the shadows of the surrounding corridors, a dozen burly men stepped out into the sunlight. They were not dressed in the Crown Prince's colors, but in the dark, unmarked leather armor of hired muscle. Their hands resting menacingly on the hilts of drawn sabers as they formed a tight, lethal ring around my desk. Chapter 4. The 12 mercenaries drew their sabers in unison. The harsh scrape of cheap steel ringing across the sunlit courtyard. Head steward Peng crossed his arms over his rotund stomach, a sickeningly triumphant smile stretching across his face. The Eastern Palace is a dangerous place, Wangfei, Peng mocked, his voice dripping with false pity. Tragic accidents happen to young brides who meddle in affairs beyond their comprehension. A sudden slip by the lotus pond. A tragic misunderstanding with a rogue guard. I did not stand up. I did not scream for the palace sentries. Instead, I calmly reached out, picked up my porcelain teacup, and took a slow, measured sip of jasmine tea. You are paying these men with stolen silver, I stated evenly, setting the teacup down with a soft clink. And based on the poor quality of their armor and the rust on their blades, you are severely underpaying them while pocketing the difference. A greedy merchant is a foolish merchant, Steward Peng. And a foolish merchant always leaves himself exposed. Peng sneered, raising his hand to signal the execution. Silence her. Before the mercenaries could take a single step forward, a heavy, silver-tipped spear descended from the sky like a thunderbolt. It shattered the stone paving directly between Steward Peng's feet, the impact sending a shockwave that knocked the portly man backward onto the dirt. The heavy courtyard gates did not just open, they were violently kicked inward, splintering off their iron hinges. Crown Prince Zhao Jingting strode into the courtyard. The terrifying aura of a military commander who had spent his life wading through blood radiated from him in dark, suffocating waves. Within seconds, his elite personal vanguard flooded the walls, their bows drawn and arrows nocked, every single one aimed at Peng's hired thugs. The mercenaries immediately dropped their rusted sabers and fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads against the shattered stone in absolute terror. Steward Peng, Jingting said. His voice was not a shout. It was a deadly, frozen whisper that carried across the dead silence of the estate. You dare raise weapons against the primary wife of this palace, in my own courtyard? Why, your highness? Peng stammered, his arrogant facade crumbling into pathetic weeping as he scrambled backward. She is a spy. She was falsifying the ledgers to frame me. I was only protecting your estate. Jingting did not even deign to look at the man. He gestured sharply to his vanguard. Take him to the dungeons. Extract every name connected to his smuggling ring. Then sever his hands. Let the rest of the inner court see the price of stealing from the imperial vanguard. As the screaming steward and his mercenaries were dragged away, Jingting turned his dark, searching gaze toward my desk. He took in my relaxed posture, the perfectly organized ledgers, and the still steaming cup of tea. A dozen drawn blades, Jingting murmured, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing in intense evaluation. Yet your hand did not tremble when you poured that tea. Panic does not balance the ledgers, your highness, I replied, opening a fresh bamboo slip. The rebellion in your inner court has been quelled. But the primary issue remains. You are missing 3,000 shur of winter grain. Without it, your northern garrisons will starve before the first snowfall. Jingting's jaw tightened. I will petition the Ministry of Revenue for a resupply. The ministry is controlled by my father, I reminded him flatly. If you ask for grain, he will know your supply lines are compromised and use it to cripple your military standing. We must procure the provisions quietly, outside the imperial channels. Before he could argue, I stood up, smoothing my indigo robes. Have a discreet carriage prepared. I require a trip to the Great Zion Temple to pray for the prosperity of our new union. 3 hours later, the heavy scent of burning sandalwood and incense masked my movements. Leaving my handmaidens to burn paper offerings in the main hall of the temple, I slipped through a side gate into a secluded, heavily shaded bamboo pavilion. Waiting for me at a stone table was a man draped in an unassuming gray traveler's cloak, a wide bamboo hat with a thick dark veil obscuring his face entirely. This was the Shadow Merchant, a rumored titan of the underground trade routes whose network I had deeply respected in my past life. You request a dangerous volume of grain, Crown Princess, the veiled man said, his voice deep, raspy, and laced with quiet amusement. The capital is watching the Eastern Palace closely. Smuggling 3,000 shur under the Grand Chancellor's nose will require an exorbitant fee. I did not come to haggle over coppers, I said coldly, sitting opposite him. I slid a heavy wooden token across the table. The seal of my dowry estate. This guarantees payment upon delivery. But I demand sole exclusivity to your trade routes in the northern provinces. You will supply no other imperial faction but mine. The man chuckled, a rich sound that carried an odd, haunting familiarity. You are vastly different from the spoiled, vicious girl the capital whispers about. Very well. A binding covenant it is. He reached up with a scarred hand and pulled the bamboo hat from his head, casting the dark veil aside to finalize the agreement. I froze. Staring back at me were the unmistakable, sharp imperial features of the Zhao bloodline. The same storm-dark eyes and strong jaw as my husband. But this man's face was older, weathered, and marred by a brutal sword scar cutting across his left cheek. My mind raced through the imperial family trees, landing on a terrifying conclusion. He was Zhao Lanting, the brilliant, beloved first prince who had supposedly been assassinated in an ambush 5 years ago. Chapter 5. I stared at the scarred, highly recognizable face of the supposedly deceased first prince. A normal woman of the capital would have screamed, fainted, or immediately fled to report his survival to the emperor for a massive bounty. I merely adjusted my posture and tapped my finger against the stone table. I see, I said smoothly, my voice devoid of any shock. The imperial records state you were ambushed by northern barbarians 5 years ago. Your body was never recovered. I must say, faking your own death to escape the deadly politics of the capital and establish an untraceable black market monopoly is a remarkably sound business strategy. Zhao Lanting blinked, his smug, dramatic reveal completely falling flat. He let out a bark of rough laughter, shaking his head. You are terrifying, little sister-in-law. My brother is a fool if he does not realize the weapon he married. Yes, I chose the shadows over a poisoned throne. And because of my unique position, I can move your 3,000 shur of grain across the borders without triggering a single imperial checkpoint. Then we have a deal, I said, rising to my feet and offering a crisp formal bow. I expect the first shipment at the western gate by the new moon. Do not be late. I penalize heavily for delays. With the military supply lines secured, the Eastern Palace stabilized over the next few weeks. Jingting, though still fiercely guarded, began to look at me less like an enemy spy and more like an incredibly dangerous, highly useful asset. Our fragile alliance was put to the ultimate test exactly 1 month later, during the Emperor's annual Spring Blossom Banquet. The Imperial Palace was a dazzling display of wealth and treacherous court politics. Thousands of silk lanterns illuminated the Grand Hall. I sat beside Jingting at the highest table of honor, draped in heavy, stifling layers of violet and gold court silks. Across the room, seated uncomfortably close to the Emperor, was my father, the Grand Chancellor. His cold eyes tracked my every movement, searching for any sign of weakness. The Crown Prince has labored tirelessly to secure our borders, the Emperor announced, his voice echoing over the quieted hall. He was an aging, paranoid man, easily manipulated by the whispers of the Wei clan. He raised a hand, and the head eunuch stepped forward, carrying a singular, exquisite cup carved from rare white jade. To honor your service, Jingting, the emperor smiled, a thin, entirely hollow expression. I bestow upon you a cup of the imperial cellar's finest spring nectar. Drink deeply, my son. Jingting stood, his face a perfect mask of dutiful reverence. He bowed low, accepting the white jade cup from the eunuch's trembling hands. As Jingting brought the cup closer to his chest, a stray current of air drafted across the table, carrying the scent of the wine directly toward me. In my past life, managing the spice and herbal trade routes required an impeccable sense of smell. I knew the scent of every flower, every root, and every venom sold on the black market. Beneath the sweet, heavy aroma of plum blossoms in the wine, there was a faint, sharp metallic undertone. Ghost weed. It was an extraordinarily rare, nearly untraceable poison from the southern swamps. It did not kill instantly. It took hours, slowly paralyzing the lungs while the victim slept, making the death appear entirely natural. Jingting raised the cup toward his lips, preparing to honor the emperor's toast. I had a fraction of a second to act. I could not scream that the wine was poisoned. Accusing the emperor of assassinating his own son in front of the entire court would result in an immediate execution for treason. I had to destroy the cup without looking like I was saving his life. I needed to be a clumsy, foolish bride. As Jingting tilted the cup, I aggressively slammed the heavy toe of my embroidered slipper down onto the dragging hem of my own violet silk gown. I threw my entire body weight to the left, letting out a sharp, perfectly pitched shriek of alarm as I supposedly lost my balance. I crashed violently into Jingting's side. The impact knocked his arm sideways. The white jade cup slipped from his grasp, falling to the hard marble floor. It shattered into a dozen glittering pieces, the poisoned spring nectar splashing across the pristine white stone. Where the liquid pooled, the polished marble faintly, almost imperceptibly, began to hiss and discolor. The grand hall fell deathly silent. The musicians stopped playing. The dancers froze. I kept my head bowed in false terror, but from beneath my lashes, I looked up at Jingting. He was staring down at the discolored, faintly hissing marble floor. His storm-dark eyes widened imperceptibly as he recognized the trap he had just narrowly escaped. Then he looked at me, huddled on the floor, absorbing the wrath of the most powerful man in the empire just to keep his heart beating. The suspicion in Jingting's eyes completely vanished, replaced by an intense, terrifyingly protective fire. Chapter 6. Forgive her, Imperial Father. Jingting's voice cut through the suffocating silence of the grand hall. It was not a plea. It was a heavy, commanding statement that dared anyone to argue. He gracefully dropped to one knee beside me, his broad shoulders intentionally shielding my huddled form from the emperor's furious gaze and my father's calculating stare. The fault is mine, Jingting continued smoothly, bowing his head. I purchased these heavy northern silks for my wife, not realizing the train was far too long for the palace steps. She simply tripped. It is a tragic waste of the imperial cellar's finest nectar, but it was nothing more than a foolish bride's clumsiness. The emperor's face twitched. He desperately wanted to order my execution for the insult, but punishing a clumsy woman for tripping over a dress purchased by her husband, the celebrated military hero of the empire, in front of all the assembled nobility would make the throne look incredibly petty. See to it that your wife learns proper court etiquette, Crown Prince, the emperor finally spat, waving his hand in disgust. Take her from my sight. She has ruined the harmony of the evening. Jingting did not hesitate. He stood up, and without asking for my permission, he bent down and scooped me entirely into his arms. I gasped at the sudden loss of gravity, instinctively clutching the lapels of his crimson robes. He carried me out of the grand hall, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line, ignoring the shocked whispers of the court. He did not speak until we were secured inside our carriage, the wooden wheels rattling heavily against the cobblestones of the capital. The carriage was dark, lit only by a single paper lantern swaying from the roof. Jingting sat opposite me. The terrifying aura of the battlefield had returned to him, but it was no longer directed at me. He stared at my face for a long, intense moment. Ghost weed, he finally murmured, his voice barely a whisper above the noise of the carriage wheels. I smoothed the skirts of my ruined violet gown, maintaining my composed, merchant-like facade. I am unfamiliar with the term, Your Highness. I simply have a terrible sense of balance. Do not insult my intelligence, Wanyue, Jingting said, leaning forward. The the space between us suddenly felt incredibly small. His storm-dark eyes burned with an intensity that made my pulse accelerate. Ghost weed is a poison favored by the southern assassins. It is nearly odorless. Yet, you smelled it over the incense and the plum blossoms from a foot away, and you risked the Emperor's wrath to break that cup. A dead husband is a terrible return on my investment, I replied evenly, meeting his gaze. If you die, my covenant is void, and my father's assassins will ensure I do not live to see the dawn. I merely protected my assets. Jingting did not look offended by my clinical reasoning. In fact, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile curved his lips. He reached into his robes, unclasped a heavy iron key from his inner belt, and tossed it into my lap. What is this? I asked, picking up the heavy metal. The key to the Eastern Palace's private treasury, Jingting said softly. You have proven your loyalty, and your capability in the inner court is undeniable. The steward's answer to you. The black market grain is secure. It is time you managed my true ledgers. It was an unprecedented show of trust. In the imperial capital, a prince handing over the keys to his personal wealth was the ultimate surrender of power to a spouse. The next morning, I did not delay. I descended into the subterranean vault of the Eastern Palace. It was vast, filled with chests of silver, bolts of tribute silk, and rare jewels. But I ignored the physical wealth and walked directly to the massive mahogany desk at the back of the room, piled high with military expenditure logs. I sat down, pulled out my abacus, and began to audit the Crown Prince's true military strength. For the first 2 hours, the numbers were flawless. The infantry payrolls, the cavalry horse feed, the weapon repairs, everything was meticulously recorded. But as I cross-referenced the steel requisition forms with the border garrison reports, a chilling discrepancy emerged. The math did not align. Jingting was funding the Northern Vanguard, an army stationed to fight light, fast-moving nomadic tribes. Yet, according to these hidden ledgers, over the past 3 years, he had secretly commissioned 30,000 sets of heavy infantry plate armor, 500 reinforced siege ladders, and massive quantities of refined black powder. Heavy armor and siege ladders were entirely useless in the northern steppes. You could not catch a nomad on horseback while wearing 40 pounds of iron. Siege ladders and heavy infantry were only used for one thing: breaching high stone walls. My blood ran cold. The abacus beads slipped from my fingers, clicking sharply in the quiet vault. He was not just securing the borders. The Crown Prince was aggressively funding and preparing a massive, highly illegal standing army to march south, to lay siege to the capital itself. Jingting was planning a full-scale rebellion to overthrow his father and slaughter the Wei clan. And by signing a mutually binding covenant and seizing control of his ledgers, I had just legally established myself as the primary financial backer of the greatest treason in the history of the dynasty. Chapter 7. Treason is, at its core, merely a hostile takeover with a significantly higher mortality rate. Sitting in the dim, subterranean vault of the Eastern Palace, I stared at the irrefutable proof of Crown Prince Zhao Jingting's impending rebellion. I did not scream, nor did I faint. I simply reached for my abacus and began to calculate the burn rate of a 30,000-strong heavy infantry unit. If the Crown Prince marched on the capital and failed, I would be executed alongside him as his legal wife and financial backer. If he succeeded, he would become the emperor, and my 3-year covenant for 50,000 silver taels would effectively be guaranteed by the imperial treasury. Therefore, failure was an unacceptable loss of investment. Jingting's rebellion had to succeed, which meant I needed to aggressively protect his assets from my own family. I locked the ledgers away, secured the heavy iron door of the vault, and made my way back to my private courtyard. Dusk had fallen, painting the sky in deep hues of violet and bruised orange. As I approached the moon gate of my quarters, a subtle flutter of movement near the ornamental plum trees caught my eye. It was Pinger, the dowry maid my father had insisted I bring to the Eastern Palace. She stood in the shadows of the garden, nervously looking over her shoulder as her trembling hands attached a tiny, hollow bamboo tube to the leg of a messenger pigeon. I stepped through the moon gate, my indigo silk robes making no sound against the paving stones. The evening air is quite cool for bird watching, Pinger. The maid violently jumped, nearly crushing the poor pigeon. She spun around, her face draining of all color as she dropped to her knees, frantically trying to hide the bird behind her back. Wang Fei, she stammered, her eyes wide with terror. I I found this bird injured by the pavilion. I was trying to release it. Bring it here, I commanded, my voice flat, holding out my hand. Pinger hesitated, a tear slipping down her cheek, but the cold authority in my tone left no room for defiance. Trembling, she crawled forward and placed the pigeon into my hands. I gently held the bird and unfastened the tiny bamboo tube from its leg. Inside was a tightly rolled slip of premium rice paper. I unrolled it. The message was written in a complex merchant cipher. A code my father assumed a spoiled, foolish daughter would never be able to read. Fortunately, in my past life as a guild master, I had broken ciphers far more intricate than this to undercut my competitors' spice routes. The Western Gate receives 3,000 share of grain. The prince's vanguard numbers swell. Morale is dangerously high. My father was attempting to track our supply lines. If he received this, he would immediately dispatch the Imperial Guard to intercept Zhao Lanting's black market caravans. You are a very diligent spy, Pinger, I murmured, walking over to the stone lantern illuminating the garden path. I pulled a small stick of charcoal from my sleeve, a tool I always carried for quick ledger corrections. Please, Wangfei, have mercy, Pinger sobbed, pressing her forehead to the dirt. The Chancellor holds my younger brother hostage in the main estate. If I do not send reports, he will kill my family. I do not punish employees for operating under duress, I said calmly. But I do require you to change management. Using the sharp edge of the charcoal, I expertly altered the strokes of the tiny characters on the rice paper. It was a delicate forgery, mimicking my father's cipher perfectly. The Western Gate receives 300 share of rotting grain. The prince's vanguard starves. Morale is broken. Stand up, Pinger, I ordered. She cautiously raised her head, bewildered. I rolled the altered paper back into the bamboo tube, fastened it to the pigeon's leg, and tossed the bird into the air. It fluttered its wings and disappeared into the darkening sky, carrying a perfectly crafted lie directly to the Grand Chancellor. From this moment on, you report only to me, I told the trembling maid. You will continue to send messages to my father, but only the intelligence I provide you. Do this flawlessly, and when the Eastern Palace secures its final victory, I will personally guarantee your brother's safety and provide you both with a generous severance package. Do we have a covenant? Pinger stared at me as if I were a descending deity. She bowed so deeply her forehead struck the stone. Yes, Wangfei. My life is yours. Excellent. Now go wash your face. Crying is an inefficient use of hydration. As the maid scrambled away to the servants' quarters, I let out a slow breath, brushing the charcoal dust from my fingers. I turned to walk back to my bedchamber, but I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing half concealed in the deep shadows of the plum trees, his arms crossed over his chest, was Zhao Jingting. He stepped out into the light of the stone lantern. The terrifying, battle-hardened crown prince had been watching the entire exchange. His dark crimson robes seemed to absorb the evening shadows, and his storm-gray eyes were locked onto my face with an intensity that made the air in the courtyard feel suddenly, impossibly thin. You just fed the Grand Chancellor falsified military intelligence, Jingting said, his deep voice wrapping around me like physical heat. He closed the distance between us in slow, deliberate steps until he was towering over me. You protected my supply lines, and you turned his own spy against him. Why? I kept my chin raised, refusing to step back. Because a successful rebellion requires a flawless monopoly on information, Your Highness. And as I discovered in your private vault today, your upcoming siege on the capital is the largest investment in my portfolio. I protect my investments. Jingting did not look angry that I had uncovered his treason. Instead, he reached out, his large, calloused hand gently catching a stray lock of hair that had fallen across my cheek. His thumb brushed against my skin, sending an unbidden, electric shiver down my spine. You are the most dangerous creature in this entire empire, Wei Wanyue, he murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to my lips before rising to meet my eyes with burning, undisguised hunger. And I am beginning to realize that 3 years will not be nearly enough time with you. Chapter 8. The warmth of his calloused hand against my skin sent a dangerous, highly uncalculated tremor through my pulse. As a former master of the trading guilds, I was accustomed to high-stakes negotiations, hostile rivalries, and the cold, hard certainty of silver taels. I was not accustomed to the suffocating, magnetic pull of a crown prince whose eyes promised both absolute ruin and absolute devotion. 3 years, Jingting repeated, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper that made the garden feel entirely too small. He stepped closer, the rich silk of his crimson robes brushing against my indigo skirts. You drafted a covenant of separation, Wanyue. But the more I watch you command this palace, the more I realize I have no intention of letting my greatest ally walk away with a mere chest of silver. A covenant is bound by ink and imperial seal, Your Highness. I managed to say, though my voice lacked its usual icy authority. I forced myself to meet his storm-dark gaze, desperately trying to maintain the upper hand in this negotiation. To break it would ruin your prestige as an honorable commander. I am preparing to march on the capital and seize the dragon throne, Jingting murmured, his thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw. I believe my prestige as an obedient, honorable subject is already comfortably destroyed. He had backed me into a corner, both physically and rhetorically, the stone wall of the moon gate pressed against my shoulders. He lowered his head, his face drawing agonizingly close to mine. The scent of sandalwood, cold steel, and rain filled my senses. My brilliant, calculating mind, the same mind that could audit 1,000 ledgers in a single evening, suddenly went entirely blank. I closed my eyes, my breath hitching as his lips hovered a hair's breadth from mine. The negotiation was over. I was about to surrender all my leverage. Bang! The heavy wooden doors of the outer courtyard were violently thrown open, slamming against the stone walls with the force of a thunderclap. Jingting tore himself away from me, the tender intimacy vanishing in a fraction of a second. The lethal, battle-hardened general returned instantly. His sword sang as he drew it from its jade scabbard, stepping in front of me to shield my body before the echo of the doors had even faded. A man stumbled through the archway and collapsed onto the paving stones. He was clad in the leather and iron armor of the Northern Vanguard, but the metal was hacked and dented, and his tunic was soaked in dark, drying blood. He clutched a shattered spear in one hand, gasping for breath as he dragged himself forward. Your Highness, the scout choked out, coughing violently as he pressed his forehead to the dirt at Jingting's boots. Report, Jingting commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. The sudden shift in his aura was terrifying. He was no longer a man standing in a quiet garden, but a warlord facing the abyss. An ambush, the scout wept, his body trembling with exhaustion and agony. The northern tribes, they were not fighting alone. They possessed imperial steel. They wielded our own siege weapons. Someone from the capital supplied them with the exact layout of our defenses. My blood ran instantly cold. Imperial steel. Someone in the capital had funded the barbarians to wipe out the Crown Prince's army. It was my father. The Grand Chancellor had circumvented my altered pigeon messages entirely by striking a treasonous bargain directly with the enemy. He was willing to sacrifice the Empire's borders just to eliminate Jingting. Jingting's grip on his sword tightened, until his knuckles turned bone white. The Northern Pass? Fallen, Your Highness, the scout sobbed, his voice breaking. The garrison is slaughtered. The enemy marches upon the border city, and the remaining captains beg for your reinforcements before the walls are breached. Jingting stared down at the bleeding soldier, his jaw locked in a rigid line of pure, unadulterated fury. The quiet, fragile peace we had built in the Eastern Palace was gone, shattered by the brutal reality of war. He slowly sheathed his sword and turned to look at me, the storm in his eyes darker and more dangerous than I had ever seen. The time for manipulating ledgers in the shadows had passed. The true battle for the Empire had begun. Chapter 9. The Eastern Palace transformed from a quiet, tense estate into a terrifying war camp within the hour. Torches blazed across the courtyards as armorers hastily strapped iron plates onto the elite vanguard. The heavy thud of war horses being saddled echoed through the night. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin, sweat, and the cold metallic anticipation of bloodshed. I did not have time to dwell on the intimate moment that had been shattered in the garden. I sat at my wooden desk in the center of the chaos, my abacus clicking furiously as I authorized the release of the black market grain we had secured from Zhao Lanting. Jingting approached my desk. He was a terrifying vision of martial absolute power, clad in dark, heavy scale armor that drank the torchlight. His crimson cape billowed slightly in the night wind, and his jade-hilted sword was firmly secured at his hip. I am taking the heavy infantry and riding north to break the siege, Jingting said, his voice hard, though his storm-dark eyes lingered on my face with a heavy, unspoken weight. I am leaving a contingent of my best guards to escort you to a secure safe house in the southern provinces. If the capital falls, Or if your father attempts a direct strike while I am gone, you will be safe. I stopped my calculations and looked up at him. I am not going to the southern provinces, Your Highness. Jingting's jaw tightened. Wanyue, this is not a negotiation. The Grand Chancellor knows you altered his spy's messages. He will realize you have allied with me. You are a massive liability to his plans, which means you are a target. If I flee, he will seize the Eastern Palace, confiscate your private treasury, and sever your supply lines, I stated, rising to my feet. I stepped around the desk to face him. An army marches on its stomach. If you lose the capital's underground trade routes, your men will starve before they even reach the border. I am the only one who can navigate Zhao Lanting's network and keep the Chancellor distracted with bureaucratic red tape. Jingting stared at me, the fierce protector warring with the pragmatic general. He knew my logic was flawless. The Empire's wealth flowed through the capital, and without a steward managing the funds, his rebellion would suffocate. You are infuriatingly stubborn, he growled, though there was no real anger in his tone, only a deep, aching terror at the thought of leaving me in the viper's nest. I am fiercely protective of my investments, I corrected softly. Go to the border, Jingting. Slaughter the barbarians, secure the pass, and return to collect your throne. I will hold the Eastern Palace until you arrive. He did not reply with words. Jingting stepped forward, the heavy iron plates of his armor clashing as he reached out and grabbed me. He broke the first rule of our ironclad covenant without a single ounce of hesitation. His hands, rough and calloused from years of holding a sword, tangled in my hair, tilting my head back as his lips crashed down on mine. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, burning brand of claiming, a fierce, devastating promise forged in the fires of impending war. The world around us, the shouting soldiers and the blazing torches, simply vanished. He kissed me like a starving man, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist, pulling me flush against his cold armor. When he finally pulled away, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes burning with a dark, consuming fire. If any man in this capital dares to touch a single hair on your head, I will burn this city to the ground, Jingting swore, his voice trembling with raw emotion. He stepped back, mounted his massive warhorse, and without looking back, led his army out into the night. 2 agonizing months passed. The capital was a suffocating pressure cooker of political intrigue. My father, the Grand Chancellor, attempted to breach the Eastern Palace no less than 4 times under the guise of imperial tax inspections. I fought him off at the gates every single time, burying his officials in a mountain of fabricated ledgers, obscure trade laws and sheer unrelenting merchant stubbornness. By night, I secretly funneled silver to Zhao Lanting, ensuring a constant stream of medicinal herbs and rations made it to the northern front. Every day was a battle of wits. I slept in shifts, my indigo robes practically serving as my armor, my abacus my only weapon. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the Eastern Palace held firm. My investment was secure. Until the autumn rains began. I was sitting in the main hall, reviewing the winter silk invoices, when a commotion erupted at the main gates. Shouts of alarm echoed through the courtyard. I dropped my brush and hurried outside. A single battered supply cart had rolled through the heavy wooden gates, pulled by an exhausted, mud-spattered horse. Slumped in the driver's seat was one of Jingting's elite guards, his armor heavily damaged, his face pale with blood loss. My heart seized in my chest. I ran to the cart as the estate servants rushed to help the wounded man. The guard fell from the seat, dropping to his knees before me. With trembling, blood-stained hands, he reached into his tunic and produced a small, beautifully carved wooden box, along with a heavy scroll bearing the imperial military seal. Wang Fei, the guard choked out, tears mixing with the rain on his face. An ambush in the ravines. The vanguard was separated. I was ordered to bring this back to the capital, immediately. With hands that felt entirely numb, I took the wooden box and flipped the brass latch. Resting on a bed of dark velvet was a shattered piece of flawless green jade. It was the intricate guan, the royal headpiece Jingting wore to signify his rank. It was cracked down the middle, the edges stained with dark, dried blood. I unrolled the heavy parchment scroll. It was an official report from the surviving border captains. The ink blurred as my eyes scanned the harsh, unforgiving characters. The Crown Prince's battalion had been trapped by an unexpected landslide, orchestrated by the enemy. There were no survivors found in the wreckage. Crown Prince Zhao Jingting was officially declared slain in combat. Chapter 10. A lesser woman would have collapsed into the mud, weeping and tearing at her hair. A traditional widow of the empire would have immediately donned rough hemp, ordered the estate draped in white silk, and prepared for the inevitable descent of the imperial scavengers. I was neither. I was a master merchant, and a master merchant does not write off a priceless asset until she has personally inspected the wreckage and settled the ledgers. I stared at the blood-stained, shattered jade guan in the wooden box. The rain poured down around us, washing the mud from the exhausted guard's armor. My heart hammered against my ribs with a violent, agonizing rhythm, but my hands, holding the imperial scroll, remained absolutely still. Who else knows of this dispatch? I asked, my voice a hollow, chilling whisper that cut through the sound of the rain. No one, Wang Fei, the guard rasped, clutching his side. The commanding captain sealed the dispatch before giving it to me. I rode straight for the capital, without stopping at the imperial way stations. Excellent, I said, snapping the wooden box shut. I turned to the loyal estate servants who had gathered around the cart, their faces pale with unspoken terror. Take him to the physician's quarters. Treat his wounds with our finest herbs. And listen to me very carefully. No one speaks a word of this cart's arrival. As far as the capital is concerned, the crown prince is merely delayed by the autumn rains. If a single whisper of his death breaches these walls, my father will have us all executed before nightfall. Do you understand? The servants, trembling but fiercely loyal to the order I had brought to their lives, bowed deeply. Yes, Wang Fei. I returned to my private chambers, the heavy wooden box clutched to my chest. Once the doors were securely bolted, I allowed myself exactly 1 minute of weakness. I sank to the floorboards, pressing the shattered jade to my cheek, and let out a single ragged breath that tore at my throat. I remembered the heavy, suffocating weight of his armor against me, the desperate fire in his final kiss, and the vow he had made to burn the city to the ground for me. If you are truly dead, Zhao Jingting, I thought fiercely, wiping a single traitorous tear from my jaw, I will collect the debts owed to you in blood. I stood up, stripped off my damp outer garments, and pulled on a stark white silk underrobe, the traditional color of mourning. But over it, I fastened my heavy, imposing indigo merchant silks, hiding my grief entirely from the world. There was no time to mourn, there was only time to fortify. Knowing my father, the Grand Chancellor, would receive his own spy reports from the Northern Front within days, I moved with ruthless efficiency. I unlocked Jingting's private subterranean vault and emptied a massive portion of the silver reserves. I sent a coded missive through Zhao Lanting's underground network, liquidating the silver into the most valuable commodity in a time of war. Sheer unrestrained violence. Within 48 hours, the Eastern Palace was no longer just an estate. It was an impregnable fortress. 300 elite, heavily scarred mercenaries from the lawless western deserts slipped through our secret supply tunnels under the cover of darkness. They owed no allegiance to the emperor, only to the silver I poured into their hands. I stationed them along the high stone walls, armed with the heavy crossbows I had diverted from the winter ledgers. I took absolute monopoly over the Eastern Palace's defenses, waiting for the inevitable hostile takeover. I did not have to wait long. On the morning of the fourth day, a terrifying, rhythmic thrumming shook the cobblestones of the capital. It was the synchronized march of hundreds of heavily armored men. I stood in the center of the main courtyard, my abacus resting quietly on my desk, flanked by 2 towering desert mercenaries. Boom! 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 The heavy, iron-reinforced wooden gates of the Eastern Palace shuddered under the brutal impact of a battering ram. The noise was deafening. Wei Wanyue! A voice roared from the other side of the high stone walls. It was a voice I recognized instantly, smooth, cold, and dripping with arrogant authority. It was my father. Open these gates by order of the Grand Chancellor, he bellowed, his voice amplified by the silence of the terrified city streets. The Crown Prince has fallen in battle. I am here with the Emperor's Imperial Guard to secure the estate, confiscate the traitor's wealth, and arrest his accomplices. The heavy wood of the gates groaned, the massive iron hinges protesting under another strike from the ram. My father had brought the full, terrifying weight of the Imperial army to my doorstep, absolutely certain he would find a defenseless, weeping widow ready to be dragged to the executioner's block. Chapter 11. The heavy wooden gates shuddered violently, dust and splintered wood raining down upon the courtyard paving stones. I signaled the desert mercenaries to hold their fire. I smoothed the lapels of my indigo silk robes, walked up the stone stairs to the high ramparts, and looked down over the parapet. Below, the street was a sea of imperial armor. Hundreds of guards stood in disciplined formation, their halberds gleaming in the morning sun. At their head sat my father, the Grand Chancellor, atop a massive black stallion. He looked impeccably dressed in his heavy court robes, a cruel, triumphant smile playing upon his lips as he watched the battering ram strike the wood again. "Father," I called out, my voice steady and carrying clearly over the clamor. It is incredibly poor etiquette to visit a married daughter's estate without sending a formal missive first. The Grand Chancellor sneered, raising his hand to temporarily halt the battering ram. "Wanyue, cease this foolishness. The Crown Prince is dead in the northern ravines. His estate, his wealth, and his treasonous accomplices now belong to the Emperor. Open the gates, or I will have you dragged out by your hair and thrown into the imperial dungeons." "I am afraid I must deny your request on matters of imperial law," I replied, leaning casually against the cold stone battlements. "According to the edicts of the founding emperor, a royal estate cannot be seized without a formal decree bearing the vermilion seal. Furthermore, as the primary wife, I am legally entitled to a mourning period of 100 days before the estate ledgers can even be audited. You have no decree, and I am certainly not finished mourning." My father laughed, a sharp, barking sound that held no warmth. "You speak of imperial edicts as if they protect a traitor's nest. We have proof of Jingting's rebellion. I do not need a piece of parchment to burn this palace to the ground." "If you burn this palace, you burn the Crown Prince's private treasury," I countered smoothly. "Millions of silver taels, bolts of tribute silk and priceless jade. I know you, father. You did not come here for justice. You came to line your own pockets to fund your political ambitions." His eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. "Break down the gates," he roared to the men manning the ram. "I would strongly advise against that," I shouted, dropping my merchant facade and letting my voice ring with absolute authority. I raised a hand, and the mercenaries on the wall stepped back, revealing heavy clay barrels positioned along the parapets and throughout the inner courtyards. The Eastern Palace is no longer a residence. It is a powder keg. I have rigged the entire estate and the subterranean vaults with enough black powder to level 3 city blocks. The Imperial Guards hesitated, looking nervously up at the clay barrels. "If your ram strikes that gate one more time," I threatened, my eyes locked dead onto my father's, "I will ignite the fire cords. We will all be buried under a mountain of rubble, and you will not see a single copper coin of the Crown Prince's wealth. Withdraw your men." For a tense, suffocating moment, the street was entirely silent. The autumn wind pulled at the Chancellor's heavy robes. I waited for the panic, for the tactical retreat. Instead, the Grand Chancellor threw back his head and laughed. It was a cold, echoing sound of absolute, devastating victory. "You always were a clever girl, Wanyue," he called up, a vicious grin stretching across his face. "But a merchant only looks at what is inside her own warehouse. You forgot to check the perimeter." He gestured to his lieutenant. The man stepped forward, holding a massive bundle of thick, severed hempen cords, my primary ignition lines that I had buried beneath the outer walls to trigger the main vault. My stomach plummeted. He had dug up the external fire cords. The black powder in the vault was useless. "Did you truly think I would not secure the perimeter of a siege before I knocked on your door?" my father mocked, drawing his sword from its scabbard. He turned to the ranks of archers lining the street behind him. "Archers, knock pitch arrows. Light the flames." A terrifying chorus of bows being drawn filled the air, followed by the crackle of hundreds of arrows being set alight. The Imperial Guard raised their weapons, aiming the fiery barrage directly at the wooden structures and trapped courtyards of the Eastern Palace. Chapter 12. Loose. The Grand Chancellor's command tore through the morning air. A terrifying swarm of flaming arrows arced across the sky, raining down upon the Eastern Palace like a shower of falling stars. The heavy pitch burned fiercely, striking the wooden ramparts, the silk banners, and the roofs of the outer pavilions. "Get off the walls," I ordered the mercenaries, hiking up my indigo silk skirts and sprinting down the stone steps. The heat of the roaring fires was instantaneous. My meticulously calculated defense was literally going up in flames. I reached the safety of the stone-paved inner courtyard, just as the heavy wooden gates finally gave way with a deafening, splintering crash. The battering ram breached the entrance, and the Chancellor's Imperial Guard surged forward, their halberds lowered to slaughter everyone inside. My mind raced, desperately trying to calculate a viable exit strategy. I reached into my sleeve for the hidden dagger I had started carrying, preparing for a hostile, hand-to-hand liquidation. But before the first Imperial Guard could even cross the threshold of the shattered gates, the cobblestone street outside seemed to violently erupt. The ground shook, not from the synchronized march of infantry, but from the thunderous, earth-shattering charge of heavy cavalry. A deafening war cry, guttural and savage, drowned out the crackle of the burning palace. Through the thick, acrid smoke of the burning gates, a massive black warhorse crashed into the Imperial Guard's flank like a battering ram of flesh and steel. Atop the beast sat a man who looked like he had crawled out of the deepest pits of the underworld. His heavy scale armor was scarred, dented, and caked in dried mud and the blood of 1,000 enemies. His crimson cape was torn to ribbons. His dark hair whipped wildly around a face etched with absolute, terrifying fury. It was Crown Prince Zhao Jingting. He was not dead. He was a very angry, highly motivated creditor, who had come to collect his debts. Jingting swung his heavy broadsword, the blade singing a lethal note as it cleaved through the Imperial Guard lines with terrifying ease. Behind him, the surviving elite warriors of the Northern Vanguard, the same men my father had paid to have slaughtered, poured into the street, their eyes burning with the demand for vengeance. The Chancellor's meticulously organized siege devolved into absolute, chaotic slaughter in seconds. The Imperial Guards, accustomed to bullying terrified civilians in the capital, completely broke rank under the brutal assault of battle-hardened border veterans. Jingting! I breathed, a deeply unmerchant-like surge of pure relief washing over me. He had survived. My primary investment was intact. Jingting's storm-dark eyes scanned the burning courtyard through the smoke. When his gaze locked onto me, standing unharmed amidst the chaos, the murderous tension in his shoulders dropped for a fraction of a second. He kicked his warhorse forward, carving a bloody path directly toward the breached gates to reach me. But the Grand Chancellor was an old, cunning fox. Seeing his army decimated and the dead Crown Prince advancing upon him, my father abandoned his horse. Moving with a desperate, surprising agility for a man his age, he slipped through the chaotic melee and darted directly through the splintered gates of the Eastern Palace. I turned, raising my hidden dagger, but I was a logistics manager, not a martial artist. My father tackled me from the side, knocking the blade from my grasp. We crashed onto the stone paving. Before I could scramble away, he yanked me violently backward by my hair, hauling me to my feet and dragging me against his chest. The heavy, iron-shod hooves of Jingting's warhorse thundered into the courtyard, coming to a sliding halt just feet away. Jingting vaulted from the saddle, his bloodied sword raised, ready to strike my father down. He froze. The Grand Chancellor was panting heavily, a manic, desperate gleam in his eyes. He wrapped his thick arm tightly around my throat, cutting off my air. And resting lightly against the delicate pulse point of my neck was a wickedly curved, green-tinted blade. "Take one more step, Jingting," my father hissed, pressing the poisoned edge just close enough to draw a single, terrifying drop of blood from my skin, and your brilliant, treacherous wife dies before you can even swing your sword. Chapter 13. A poisoned blade against the throat is the ultimate, undeniable liquidation threat. The courtyard was frozen in a terrifying tableau. The crackle of the burning wooden pavilions and the groans of the wounded Imperial Guards faded into a dull, rushing roar in my ears. The Grand Chancellor's chest heaved against my back, his arm acting as an iron vice around my windpipe. The venom on the curved blade glinted a sickening, iridescent green in the firelight. Jingting stood completely still, his chest rising and falling heavily beneath his blood-soaked armor. For the first time since I had met the terrifying, battle-hardened general, he looked entirely paralyzed. His storm-dark eyes were locked on the single drop of blood beating at the edge of the blade, absolute dread warring with his murderous fury. "Drop the sword, Jingting," the Chancellor spat, his voice cracking with desperate, manic adrenaline. "Drop it, or I will sever her arteries and let her choke on her own blood. Order your men to lay down their arms." "Do not," I rasped, though the movement of my vocal cords made the blade bite a fraction deeper. "If you drop your weapon, he kills us both." "Silence," my father hissed, jerking my head back. I did not panic. Panic is a flaw in the system. I evaluated the physical variables. My father was older, entirely out of breath, and his balance was heavily reliant on keeping me pinned against him. He was also wearing thick, heavy, highly impractical silk court robes with a sprawling, embroidered train. I was wearing my functional, fitted indigo merchant silks, and I had excellent footwear. I caught Jingting's eye. I gave him a single, infinitesimal tilt of my chin. His eyes widened slightly, recognizing the shift in my posture. The paralyzing terror in his gaze vanished, replaced by the lethal, calculating focus of a supreme military commander. I did not try to pull away from the knife. Instead, I forcefully shifted my entire body weight backward, crushing myself heavily against my father's chest while simultaneously lifting my heavy, solid-heeled boot and stomping down with bone-cracking force onto the dragging hem of his silk court robes. The Chancellor instinctively tried to step back to adjust to my sudden shift in weight, but his foot caught violently on the pinned silk. He stumbled. For a fraction of a second, the poison blade pulled away from my neck as his arms flailed to catch his balance. That fraction of a second was all the Crown Prince needed. Jingting did not run. He pivoted his hips and hurled his heavy, bloodied broadsword like a javelin. The weapon tore through the smoke-filled air with a terrifying shriek. Thunk! The heavy steel blade completely bypassed my father's chest, instead plunging straight through the thick, embroidered silk of the Chancellor's right sleeve. The arm holding the poison dagger, and burying itself halfway to the hilt into the heavy wooden pillar of the gate behind him. My father screamed in agony as his arm was violently pinned to the wood, the bone shattered by the sheer force of the impact. The poison blade clattered uselessly onto the stone paving. I instantly dropped to the floor and rolled away. Before the Chancellor could even attempt to pull the sword from his arm, Jingting crossed the courtyard in 3 massive, terrifying strides. The Crown Prince grabbed my father by the throat, slamming him fully against the wooden pillar, his gauntlet crushing the man's windpipe. "You dared to touch her," Jingting whispered, a sound born of pure, unadulterated nightmare. The vanguard swarmed the courtyard, securing the remaining Imperial guards and dragging the gasping, defeated Chancellor away to the subterranean dungeons. Jingting did not watch them go. He turned on his heel and dropped to his knees on the ash-covered stones beside me. His large, trembling hands reached out, gently tilting my chin up to inspect the tiny, superficial cut on my neck. "Wanyue," he breathed, the name sounding like a prayer. The terrifying warlord completely vanished, leaving only a man profoundly relieved to find his world intact. "The investment is secure, Your Highness," I managed to say, offering a small, breathless smile. Jingting let out a rough, broken sound that was half laugh, half sob. He pulled me fully against his chest, burying his face in my hair, his arms locking around me as if he intended to shield me from the world forever. As the Eastern Palace burned and the capital fell to the rebellion, I rested my head against his cold, battered armor, finally closing my ledgers for the day. Epilogue. The imperial capital was completely transformed over the next 3 years. With the Wei clan eradicated and the corrupt emperor exiled to the southern provinces, Jingting ascended the dragon throne. He proved to be a harsh but deeply just ruler, stabilizing the borders and rebuilding the military. I, naturally, took absolute control of the imperial treasury, systematically routing out corruption, expanding trade with the northern steppes, and filling the imperial vaults with an unprecedented influx of wealth. It was an incredibly lucrative partnership. On a bright, crisp autumn morning, exactly 3 years to the day after a poisoned arrow had pinned our covenant to a mahogany table, I sat in the Empress's private pavilion. I was carefully packing a modest cedar chest. I smoothed out my functional indigo robes, picked up a heavy scroll of parchment, and walked out into the imperial gardens. Emperor Zhao Jingting sat at a stone table beneath a blooming osmanthus tree, reviewing military reports. He looked devastatingly regal in his dark, gold-threaded imperial robes, though the fierce, untamed edge of the battlefield commander never entirely left him. He looked up as I approached, a soft, incredibly fond smile warming his sharp features. "My Empress, to what do I owe the pleasure of this midday interruption?" I stopped at the table and presented the parchment, unrolling it flat over his reports. It was our original, heavily crumpled, arrow-pierced covenant. "Your Imperial Majesty," I said, my tone brisk and professional. "According to the stipulations outlined in Clause 3, our cohabitation covenant formally concludes today. I have audited the inner court, secured the supply lines, and balanced the imperial budget. I am now requesting my agreed-upon severance package of 50,000 silver taels." after which I will quietly separate to my southern estate." Jingting stared at the old covenant. Then he looked at the cedar chest tucked under my arm. He did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He simply leaned back in his carved stone chair, steepling his fingers, his storm-dark eyes gleaming with deep amusement and terrifying affection. 50,000 silver taels, Jingting mused slowly. "A steep price for the treasury. Are you certain your services have concluded?" "The contract has reached its expiration date," I affirmed, tapping the ink-stained paper. "I am a merchant of my word." Jingting reached into the wide sleeve of his imperial robes. He pulled out a fresh, beautifully illuminated scroll of the highest-grade golden silk, and laid it gently over the old covenant. "Then I propose a new negotiation," he said, his voice dropping to that low, magnetic rumble that still sent a shiver down my spine. "A permanent merger of assets." I looked down at the golden silk. It was not a royal decree, but a meticulously drafted covenant. Item 1. Wei Wanyue shall retain the title of Empress for the duration of her natural life, with absolute, unquestioned monopoly over the imperial treasury. Item 2. The Emperor formally surrenders all command of the inner court, his personal wealth, and his heart to her sole discretion. Item 3. No separation shall ever be permitted in this lifetime, nor the next. I stared at the flawless calligraphy, my calculating mind instantly recognizing the sheer, overwhelming value of the offer. "Infinite return on investment," I murmured softly. "Exclusively yours," Jingting promised. He stood up, closing the distance between us, and gently took the cedar chest from my hands, tossing it carelessly onto the grass. He pulled me into his arms, his touch as fiery and desperate as the day he rode to war. "Stamp your seal, Wanyue, and then come rule this empire with me." I reached for the imperial inkstone, a genuine smile finally breaking through my merchant's facade. I didn't need an abacus to know that this was the greatest deal I would ever make. That's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.